Gwen has a BA in Sociology and History from the University of Missouri St. Louis and an MSW from Washington University. She worked for 20 years in the field of psychiatric social work before switching careers to pursue a doctorate in history at Indiana University. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to start off with an apology because I was told that I had 30 minutes and I have an hour-long presentation. So what I'm going to do is I might gloss over some things. And so, oh, can you hear me? I might gloss over some things, but we can pick that up in the question and answers. If I gloss over something and you don't feel like I'm going enough in depth, bring it up during the question and answers session. One of the reasons I got interested in this particular topic is a number of reasons, but it comes out of the research that I was doing on residential segregation in St. Louis. And of course, with residential segregation, you realize that Blacks are basically denied home ownership. And studying this more and more in depth, you come to realize that the basis of wealth in this country is home ownership. We talk, I said, land ownership, because when we talk about land holding, because when we talk about the 19th century, when most of the country was involved in farming and lived in rural areas, the emphasis was on land ownership, land holding. And to be denied land holding was basically being denied the opportunity to build wealth. And so that really accounts for the current wealth gap that we have now. So I titled this Home Sweet Home because that's what is so important to people. That's what everybody holds here. And that's the basis of most people's wealth. So I wanted to just point out some of these quotes that I pulled. By the way, this is one of the most studied, when I started researching this, the information on the wealth gap is almost overwhelming. It's one of the most studied issues that is happening today. Almost every think tank, every institute is studying this issue because it's such a vexing issue and it's such a persistent issue. It's an issue that dates all the way back to enslavement, and we're still grappling with this issue today. So first of all, this is from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and they argue the racial wealth gap is one of the largest and most significant disparities in the United States today. And of course, from the Rand Corporation, a home, the single most important source of wealth in America. And then from the Urban Institute, home ownership remains the principal way most families build wealth in this country. So, okay. Now I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but the racial wealth gap is real. And of course, when we talk about wealth, we're talking about assets minus liabilities. We're not talking about income, but we'll explain that here. The median Black household in America has around $24,000 in savings, investment, home equity, and other elements of wealth. Those are generally what we call the elements of wealth, stocks, elements as well too. The median white household has around 189,000. 1/4 of all white households, in contrast to only 4% of all Black households, have a net worth in excess of $1 million. White Americans hold 10 times more wealth than Black Americans. The level of wealth held by members of the white working class consistently is 2 to 3 times higher than the level of wealth held by members of the Black professional class. Over the past 30 years, the wealth gap has widened rather than narrowed. And the Rand Corporation says that in 200 years, we could still have problems with the racial wealth disparities. Some people say 100 years. That's a conservative prediction. But usually it's 200 years or more. And that's if we do nothing. So why does the wealth gap exist? Well, first of all, we have to connect the past to the present. The differences in Black and white American economic status show the harms of the past, slavery, segregation, discrimination, live on in the present. So it's what's happening in the past. This didn't happen overnight. It's not by accident. It's federal policies, private, public policies that resulted in this current wealth gap. The large and persistent black-white wealth gap is not an accident, but follows centuries of policies that have systematically disadvantaged Black Americans' ability to build, maintain, and pass on wealth. And that's from the Center for American Progress. So we'll go back to the beginning. So it all starts with enslavement, because that's when the disadvantage began. On the eve of the Civil War, there were about 4.4 million African Americans in the country. 4 million were enslaved. And of course, if you're enslaved, you are property. You cannot own property because you are property. And also, if you're enslaved, you're not a citizen. So you cannot accumulate wealth. So what about emancipation? Well, as Carter G. Woodson said, who was the father of Negro History Week and later Negro History Month, we were nominally free, but economically enslaved. Because following this emancipation, you had nothing. You didn't earn any money, so you couldn't accumulate any savings. You couldn't own property because you were property. You had nothing. And I like this quote from W.V. Du Bois: without a cent, without a home, without land, tools, or savings, you had nothing. So when you were emancipated, you were thrown off the land. You got no compensation. So how do you build wealth from nothing? Well, that could have been corrected because there were federal land policies that helped to create wealth for white Americans, for white citizens, but Black people were left out of those policies. The first one was the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, went into effect in 1863, and it was the biggest land giveaway in the history of this country. One of the most consequential laws that the Congress passed. And what it did, it would give you 160 acres of land for a small filing fee, about $12. And if you lived on that land for 5 years and improved it, it became yours. However, 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, but of course we know the Emancipation Proclamation did not free anybody. So Black people could not take advantage of this. The vast majority of African Americans could not take advantage of this because they were enslaved. And they could not own property, even if they wanted to. So they couldn't take advantage of this act. So it was open to, it was a really progressive act. It was open to all citizens. And even if you were an immigrant and you applied for citizenship, you were eligible. Women were eligible for these $160 land grants. So it was a way, and let me say that, point this out, that this land was land that was taken from the indigenous people. Okay. So we were giving it to, basically giving it to white people. So that was 270 million acres of land that was up for the taking. Because Black people were basically unable to take advantage of the Homestead Act, and they weren't excluded in the law, but in fact, they were excluded from being able to own land. So Republicans, who were the Progressive Party at the time, passed the Southern Homestead Act that covered 5 southern states. And it was really going to be open, really it was targeted for Black people. White people could apply too, but you had to be a white person that was loyal to the Union, won a lot of those in the South. And then after the first year, even Confederates could apply for these land grants. Now the problem here is that even though it was open, specifically designed to give African Americans a chance to get land, it was going to be 80 acres of land. Most Blacks couldn't take advantage of this as well. First of all, right after the Civil War, when Blacks were emancipated, they were forced into signing contracts with their former enslavers. They were forced into tenant farm and sharecropping. So they were not able to take advantage of this land giveaway. The second reason that didn't really help many African Americans besides not being able to take advantage of the land, if you were able to take advantage of the land, it was not the best land. A lot of it was swampy, heavily forested, and was just not suitable for farming. And then in 1876, they repealed it. Now, the Homestead Act was actually not repealed until 1976, which was pretty late. But by 1934, with the Taylor Grazing Act, which basically took a lot of the land, decreased the amount of land that was available, and then most of the good land was gone. But still, Black people were not able, for most part, to take advantage of these two acts that would have really started them on the path to economic security. So who did benefit from the Homestead Act? Well, as I said, there were 4.4 million African Americans in the country at the end of the Civil War. 4 million were slaves, were formerly enslaved. They could not take advantage of this giveaway. But more than 1.6 million white families could. And those were native born, I said immigrants, because even if you were an immigrant, you applied for citizenship, you were eligible for this land. Now, some African Americans, of course, did benefit, but very few. It's estimated that maybe between 4,000 and 5,000. And I think this is interesting, and it just shows you how the past is connected to the present and how you were able to build generational wealth and pass it down. Because in the year 2000, they did a survey, and the number of adult descendants of the original Homestead Act recipients was estimated to be around 46 million. So now this is really, this was the first attempt at reparations. People talk about reparations, and that was Special Order number 15, the so-called 40 acres and a mule. And what it says that a family of 4 would be given 40 acres. A mule was not included in this. Later, Sherman said the Army had some mules that they weren't using, they could give it to these people along with their land. But how this came about was in 1865. Secretary of War Stanton and Sherman met with 20 Black leaders, and these Black leaders were ministers, those were our leaders, and their spokesman was Garrison Fraser, and they asked them, what do your people need? What do your people want? And he said, land. They said, land. That's what we want, because they saw land as the basis of economic security, the basis of economic independence. They were rural people, they were farmers, and that's what they wanted. They wanted to till the land. So, Sherman said, okay. And they had confiscated 400,000 acres of Confederate land. And they were going to give each family a 40-acre plot. And it was from the coast of South Carolina all the way down to Florida. Now the land, like I said, was 40-acre lots. At this time, the mules came later. But by June of 1865 is when the first group started moving there. 40,000 freedmen had been settled on 4,000 acres of what they call Sherman land. But however, what happened? By the way, President Lincoln co-signed this. This was fine with him. But he was assassinated in April of 1865. Andrew Johnson became the president. He was the vice president. He was from Tennessee. He was a Southern sympathizer. And he rescinded that order and gave that land back to the Confederates, the traitors who had really tried to destroy the Union. And these people were thrown off the land. So what if that promise of 40 acres and a mule had been fulfilled? Well, this is a speech we don't hear so much about that Martin Luther King gave. But Martin Luther King gave this speech in 1967. And he said that if the promise of 40 acres and a mule had been fulfilled, Black people's wealth in 1967 would have been $30 billion. Now, a lot of those corporations, the Rand Corporation, the Aspen Institute, the Urban Institute, the Center for Progress, they estimate that today, that wealth would be in the trillions. On the low end, 2.4 trillion. On a higher end, 6 to 15 trillion, depending on how you count. So this is the wealth that Black people would have if just that had been fulfilled. Okay. So I want to pivot and talk about St. Louis specifically. Because you know St. Louis was in Missouri. Missouri was a slave state. There were slaves in St. Louis, small group of slaves, because it was urban. But it was a major trading center. That photograph there is Lynch's slave, one of Lynch's slave pens, who was a very wealthy slave trader, trafficking in human bodies. It's the site of the Bush Stadium. So, and St. Louis, slavery in St. Louis is often described as mild. It was not. That's an oxymoron to say mild slavery. There's an author by the name of William Wells Brown, who was an enslaved person in the state of Missouri, in the city of St. Louis, who laid why to the myth that the slavery in St. Louis was mild. And the fact that we had over 300 freedom suits where Black people were fighting for their freedom is a testament to the harshness of slavery. So let me just say that on the eve of the Civil War, or right after, on the eve of emancipation, I should say, the percentage of Blacks in St. Louis was about 2%, which is relatively low. Now, over the years, the percentage of Blacks increased. In 1880, for example, St. Louis had probably the third largest Black population in the country, even though it was very low, something like 5%, right behind Baltimore and Philadelphia. So to white people in St. Louis, this was like a dramatic increase in the number of Black people coming into the city. And there are two historians, Glenn Moore and Selma Truman, who argue that right after the Civil War is when Black people began to be segregated. Now, of course, there was no segregation during enslavement, because enslaved people lived with their enslavers. But once you were thrown off the land, once you were thrown out of those houses because you were free, you had to live on your own. And that's when Black people began to live in these enclaves. Okay? So we see, let me just show you how the population increased. And this looks like small numbers. I mean, when we think about St. Louis City today, when I think of the Black population of St. Louis was 47%, 49%, something like that. 1900, 6.17%, doesn't sound like much. But when you're used to something like 2%, 6.17% is a lot. By 1910, 6.4, and as you see the gradual increase, 8.5, 11.3, 13.3 by 1940, but still, these were large numbers, large percentages, when you consider that this was when Black people were beginning to move further, leaving the South and moving north with the Great Migration. So we see more and more Black people coming into the city. And of course, St. Louis got a lot of those Black people because they were on their way north, trying to get as far north as they can. And St. Louis is usually the first place that they hit. It was outside the deep South. And St. Louis, let me just say that I'm assuming that everybody knows that St. Louis was a segregated city. It was Jim Crow in the city of St. Louis. So how did people react to the Great Migration that was coming up in St. Louis? More and more Black people from the South were moving north. Well, the response was hostility, segregation, and containment. And I think it's interesting that 1910 is when we mark the beginning of the Great Migration. And you know, when you come up with these numbers, periodization is always difficult in history because it wasn't like 1910 is all of a sudden we see this influence. It was gradual, as you can see. But this is when they marked the beginning of the Great Migration that lasted until 1940, the first Great Migration. So, and I think it's interesting that in 1910 is when you begin to see restrictive covenants beginning to appear. And this is when Black people were about 6% of the population. But still there was this fear of the Negro invasion. And that's what they called the invasion. I always think it's interesting that we use the same language when we talk about immigration on our southern borders. we refer to it as an invasion. And that's because it invokes fear. And they use the same language with the Great Migration. More and more blacks were moving from the south to the north. They saw it as an invasion, and they reacted accordingly. And the first thing they did was with these restrictive covenants. Of course, we were talking about that just prior to me coming up here to speak. Restrictive covenants were when groups of people got together, and it's been in the news a lot, so I know everybody knows about it, but I'll just mention it as well. It's when groups of people got together, usually on a block, maybe several blocks, and they had this pact. It was put in their deeds that they could not sell or lease their property to Negroes. Sometimes they would say Mongolians, which was their term for Asians, but usually it was Negroes. So, and restrictive covenants, like I said, began around 1910, started increasing around 1920 as more and more blacks came into the city. The number of restrictive covenants increased. And so by 1947, there were 378 restrictive covenants in the city, most covering whole blocks. And there was a book written by two scholars from Tuskegee that used St. Louis as one of the major cities that they studied with this proliferation of restrictive covenants. They say St. Louis was more aggressive than most cities in instituting these restrictive covenants. Okay, so the interesting thing about the restrictive covenants is that even though they were the work of the neighborhood associations, they usually call themselves improvement associations or some such thing. But they were usually getting a lot of assistance by the real estate industry. And I always say that the real estate, if there are villains in this story, some of those villains are the real estate industry because they have done more to segregate the city than any other particular entity other than the government itself. But these restricted covenants, a lot of these restricted covenants were spurred on by the real estate industry. They actually, sometimes they wrote the language. Sometimes there was money involved, finances involved. They would even finance these restricted covenants. So they were very, very active in segregating the city of St. Louis and ensuring that the city of St. Louis was residentially segregated. And I'm bringing this all up because it limited the options that Black people had. We'll see as we go a little bit later on some of the ways in which Blacks were blocked from owning homes. Now, this is a little pamphlet that's in our collection. It's called The Legal Segregation of Negroes in St. Louis. And it was written by this group, the housing committee, of this group called the Committee for Social Service Among Colored People in 1913, which was a survey of the segregated neighborhoods in St. Louis. Now, the Committee on Social Service Among Colored People was founded in 1906. I talked about the villains like the real estate industry. And there were some people that were doing positive things. And this organization was founded in 1906 by Blacks and whites. And they were focused on trying to improve conditions for Black people in the city of St. Louis, as more and more Black people were coming into the city. And they were concerned about this issue of segregation in the city. So they wrote this not only to talk about segregated neighborhoods in the city of St. Louis, but they also wanted to warn the public that these improvement associations and the real estate industry was involved in a movement to legally segregate the city of St. Louis. They were forming an ordinance that would make it illegal for Black people to move into a white neighborhood. Now, this is the actual law, which you can't see, but the actual ordinance that actually went on the ballot in 1916. And what it said, basically, was that if a block was 75% white, Black people could not move into that block. Legally could not move into that block. And by the same token, if a block was 75% Black, white people could not move into that block. Of course, most white people didn't want to move into a block that was 75%. This is in our collection, by the way. And this pamphlet that was written by George Stevenson, who was the pastor of Central Baptist Church, the second oldest African-American church in the city of St. Louis. He wrote this little pamphlet called Negro Assassination, that means to assassinate a race. It was really a plea that this law do not get passed. And he's making a strong case for why we should not have segregation. That particular law did pass overwhelmingly. There were some white people that were against it. I think the Post-Dispatch came out against the residential segregation ordinance. The majority of the board, all of it, came out against the residential segregation ordinance, but it passed. But it never went into effect. Number one, the NAACP had a campaign to try and stop it. They got an injunction from a judge. But even more so, there was a similar case from Kentucky, Buchanan versus Morley, that went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that these kind of ordinances were unconstitutional, so it never went into effect. However, the fact that it didn't go into effect didn't mean that there wasn't segregation. This is also in our collection. This, I really like this, but it's, and you see this language here, an entire block ruined by the Negro invasion. And every house marked X, of course, was a house occupied by a Negro. Of course, there are two houses that aren't occupied by Negroes. Just say, look at how they ruined this neighborhood. But of course, you can't tell the difference. They all look the same. There's no ruination there. But the point is that they use this kind of language and this kind of propaganda to try to scare people into voting for this ordinance. Now, I just pulled some of these articles out because I wanted to help people to understand the kind of hostility that Black people faced during this period. Now, these are all from mainstream newspapers, the Republic, the Post, the Globe. The first one is from, I think this is the lawyer for the real estate exchange. Segregation is lawful and wise. Then the second one is some from one of the welfare associations. Negroes do invade and ruin property. And then this poor woman, her home was spoiled by Negroes. And then this one, the very last one, from the priest. A priest who's saying that Black people are not welcome in his parish. And this one's, I'd almost say it's funny, some of the things that he says about Black people, if it wasn't so tragic. Yeah. Again, there's just a couple other things that are in our collection as well. Again, the colored invasion, threatened, self-defense. So this is all put in sort of language where white people are under siege from the 6% Black people in the city of St. Louis. I always say Black people couldn't invade even if they wanted to. There wasn't enough of us. So, talk a lot about the real estate industry. Has really been very instrumental in making sure that the city was segregated and stayed segregated. This is from 1923, an article that appeared in the Globe Democrat, were members of the real estate exchange. 375 members of the real estate exchange voted, 99% of them voted to carve out these Negro districts where they would determine where Black people lived. And they were, according to the article, they could not sell or rent to Black people outside of these districts that they had decided is where Black people would live. So you can see Black people had no control, basically very little control over where they live. And you can understand as the Black population began to grow, this became untenable because these places became overcrowded and Black people could not move anywhere else, more or less. I mean, there were exceptions to the rule, as you could always, but for the most part, Black people were contained in these districts that were determined by the real estate industry. Now, the end of restrictive covenants, I'm going to jump forward a bit because this is a case that originated in St. Louis, the Shelley versus Kramer case. I'm sure most people know about this one. It's one of the most famous, among the most famous Supreme Court cases because it ended, well, it didn't actually end restrictive covenants. Well, we'll talk about it. But now, this document is from the St. Louis the St. Louis Real Estate Brokers Association. This was the organization of Black realtors. It was headed by James Bush, who was the father of Margaret Bush Wilson, NAACP president, activist, board member, who had been fighting these restrictive covenants for years. Of course, he was interested, that was his business, was to sell houses. And of course, he was limited in what he could sell because of these restrictive covenants. And the lawyer that represented him in a lot of these cases that were challenged, that he legally challenged, was George Vaughn. Well, eventually they decided that they were going to really test these restrictive covenants, the legality of these restrictive covenants. So the Shelleys, Uncle J. Shelley, bought a house to a straw party, white woman bought the house, and then of course transferred the deed to the Shelleys. It's a 4,600 on Lavity. Of course, what happened was that there was a restrictive covenant on this particular block, and they were prevented from moving into the house that they had purchased. So the St. Louis Real Estate Brokers Association, headed by James Bush, formed a committee to help finance this Supreme Court case. They had the backing of the NAACP as well. George Vaughn argued that case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Shelleys. And what the Supreme Court decision said was that you can have all the restrictive covenants you want, but they're unenforceable. Because before this, the state would actually enforce these restrictive covenants. But that no longer was the case with this case. So this is why this case is so important. What was that?
What year?
Oh, 1948, I'm sorry. Oh, there, yeah, 1948. So we got the end of restricted covenants, kind of, but we didn't get the end of residential segregation. Now the other, okay, that's, okay, let me see, this is, okay. Okay, now I'm a fan of FDR. You know, he did a lot of great things for the country, but not so much for Black people. Even though Black people were brought into the Democratic Party basically because of FDR and some of his policies, which pulled people out of depression. But it was really a raw deal for Black people. One of the things that FDR did, he wanted to increase home ownership. 1933, we had the Home Owners Loan Corporation that basically bought the mortgages of homes that were close to foreclosure, gave people the opportunity to actually keep their homes and develop equity before they were amortized, which before, it means that they, you know, you're homeowners, you probably know you get principal and interest, so you're able to get equity. So for the first time, people could get equity in their homes. So this was really a boom for white people. The problem was that those loans, in fact, those government-insured loans, were only for white people. They were not for Black people. But the Homeowners Loan Corporation did. They had a manual, and they decided that they were going to color code neighborhoods. And this is a map, the St. Louis map. They were going to color code neighborhoods. And of course, at the top, best, desirable, declining, and hazardous. Well, all Black neighborhoods were hazardous. Now, according to Richard Rothstein, any Black neighborhood, read the book, any Black neighborhood was hazardous. Even if it was a stable, solid, well-kept, middle-class Black neighborhood, it was redlined. And according to Rothstein, if one Black person lived in a white neighborhood, it was redlined. So that meant you could not get a loan. You could not get a government-backed loan. So that left Black people in the lurch. They were basically denied, for the most part, home ownership. And I'll talk about how they were able to buy homes, because some Black people still, Black people always wanted to own land. They always wanted to own homes. They always wanted real estate, and they found a way to do it. So the GI Bill, another bill that expanded home ownership for whites. Now the GI Bill was for everybody. It was for Black people, Black veterans, returning veterans. It was for white returning veterans. It was for any veteran. But how could you take advantage of a VA loan if you couldn't buy outside of where you were prescribed to live? And where you could live, it was redlined and you couldn't get a loan. And the same thing, we could argue that for education as well, because a lot of schools were segregated as well. You can go to an HBCU, but that meant you had to have an HBCU within your grasp. So basically, Black people could not take advantage of this. And in fact, to get if you were a developer and you wanted to build a subdivision, the government would say it has to be for Caucasians only. This was written into a law. Charles Vatterott, who developed the St. Anne subdivision, he could not have Black people in that. He could not get government money if he was going to have Black people live in that subdivision. So he had to do a separate subdivision for Black people, where they could not get, and they could not get loans, even in that DePorus. He had St. Anne for white, DePorus for Blacks. And Blacks could not get government-backed mortgages. And of course, the houses were shoddier because you couldn't put as much money into them. He couldn't give you federal money. It had none of the amenities that the white St. Anne had, no playgrounds, no parks, nothing. So, but this was official government policy. Not just, so we're talking about not just the private sector, but the public sector as well. So how did Black people buy houses if they couldn't get mortgages? They bought on contract. In fact, I don't know why this never occurred to me, but talking to my brother, I was interviewing him, and one of the things he said, well, you know, our parents bought their house on contract. They bought it in 1939. They had it until 1960 when they were forced out. And he said they didn't have any equity in the house. But anyway, so you bought on the installment plan because you couldn't get a mortgage. So that meant that the seller kept the deeds. You didn't get the deed. You could be evicted at any time. If you missed one payment, you could be evicted. And then you had to start all over again. You had no equity. There was no equity. And you had no legal protections. And you were at the mercy of unscrupulous realtors and other sellers. You know, maybe they weren't all unscrupulous, but the point is, these were the things that you were up against if you could not get a loan and you wanted a house. Okay? So I didn't find the stats for St. Louis. So I just looked at this one in Chicago. So it's estimated that Black families in Chicago lost between 3.2 billion and 4 billion in wealth due to contract buying between 1950 and 1960. So this was another loss of wealth, another inability to accumulate wealth, to build wealth, to pass wealth on down to your children, your grandchildren, and beyond. Then we have the push for slum clearance, which was another way that Blacks were deprived of home ownership because you destroyed Black neighborhoods. And what happened when those neighborhoods were destroyed? Well, this is a 1947 map of blighted and obsolete districts. And of course, the darker ones are the obsolete districts. This is part of the 1947 city plan. And the obsolete districts were areas that were slated for slum clears. Blighted areas were ones that possibly could be saved, but probably they were going to go too. And you see, that's a lot of the city there. So, and of course, like I said, in the Black areas, or Black people, mostly Black people live. So of course, those were the areas that were slated for slum clearance. Now, this is the official, I won't read this, but that's the urban renewal was the official government policy, federal housing policy from 1949 to 1970. That's pretty late, 1970. That's not ancient history. But that's the official definition of urban renewal. It's from the Land Clearance for Redevelopment Authority right here in St. Louis. James Baldwin had a more succinct definition. He just said it's Negro removal, because of the of those urban renewal projects, Black people were, let's say, 13% of the population nationally. 55% of the urban renewal projects affected African Americans. So, and of course, Mill Creek, which you probably all know about by now, was one of the largest urban renewal projects in the country. The largest in the city of St. Louis, happened in 1959. The city of St. Louis first proposed urban renewal, slum clearance is what they called it at the time, in 1948. It was on the ballot. It failed for a number of reasons. In the meantime, in 1949, the federal government passed the Housing Act, which made federal money available for slum clearance. So they put this back on the ballot again in 54, it passed. And the destruction of this Black community and other Black communities sort of went ahead in full force. So what was the impact of this? Well, you know, this destruction of Black neighborhoods, it impeded the accumulation of Black wealth because it destroyed homes and you couldn't get another home. So what happened to these Black people that were thrown out of their homes? Well, the plan that most Black people resisted, by the way, the plan was to put them into public housing. In other words, to make them renters, not to make them homeowners, but to make them renters. So white people were slated to become homeowners. That means that they could accumulate wealth. They could pass wealth on. Black people, if you're a renter, you cannot accumulate wealth. And by the way, the majority of Black people did not go into public housing. They resisted. Most of them, most of them were north and south, as far as north and west. West St. Louis, as far as St. Louis is concerned. Now, the other major Supreme Court decision that had a specific impact, a very important impact, was the Jones versus Meyer case. So we know about the real estate industry. The real estate industry very much involved in segregating the city, maintaining segregation. You know, the restricted covenant in 1916 segregation ordinance was ruled unconstitutional, never went into effect. The Shelley versus Kramer ended restricted covenants, but it was still quite legal in private housing to tell a Black person, I'm not renting you a house, I'm not selling you a house because you're Black. And that was the case with the Jones, Joseph and Barbara Jones. He was Black, she was white. And they wanted to buy this house in North County in Paddock Woods, developed by Alfred Meyer. But the agent told them quite blatantly, I'm not going to sell you this house because, Mr. Jones, you're Black. Well, they went to Freedom of Residence, which was an organization formed in St. Louis to fight racial discrimination in housing. And they took this case to court, took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won that case. Now that was passed down in June. That Supreme Court decision came down in June of 1968. The Supreme Court ruled that this kind of blatant discrimination was unconstitutional and illegal. However, before that, April of 1968, Congress had passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which also made this illegal. So it was kind of, so we got like the Supreme Court case, and even before that, the federal government, the Congress, decided that this was illegal. Now, the interesting thing about this case is that Alfred Meyer helped finance the case against him secretly, because he wanted to be able to, well, I don't know why, I'm not sure why he did it. but I had, when I did the civil rights exhibit, I met people that knew Alfred Meyer. And I actually asked them, why would he finance this case? Was it just that he wanted to sell more houses? Was it a moral thing? Did he think it was just incomprehensible that you would do this, that you would treat Black people that way? And they said, well, I think it's a little bit of both. That he did have a pecuniary motive. He did want to sell more houses, but he also was kind of outraged about this, the racial discrimination. He wanted to be able to sell his property unfettered. So now we think this is all over with, right? That this kind of blatant racial discrimination has come to an end. You know, we got even the federal government finally saying in 1968, redlining is done. You know, it was illegal. It was unconstitutional. Never should have happened. But then we have the city of St. Louis that decides that it wants to do a new city planning document. The last one was 1947. They want to do another one. So they came up with this decision to do the new city planning document. And they hired this group, one group as a consultant, Team 4, group of St. Louis University graduates. And they came up with this idea, or what they decided is they were going to divide the city into 3 different areas: conservation, redevelopment, and depletion. Sounds a lot like what the Homeowners Loan Corporation did with their manual, where they divided cities into these 4 areas, where they divided into 3 areas. Now, I'm going to see if I can find this, because I want to read this to you, because they never said black. They weren't that, they knew better than that, to say that these areas were black. But the conservation area was the area that was okay. These areas were successful. They were good. They were like the green areas, the best, the Homeowners Loan Corporation said. So they were fine, didn't have to worry about those. Then there were the redevelopment areas. They were kind of on the brink. They weren't bad, but you know, they might need a little help, but you know, we didn't have to worry too much about those. But then he had the depletion areas, and I've got to read this because I think it's so how they describe the depletion areas. Now, keep in mind, they never said where these areas were. They never said what area was a white area or black area, like the Homeowners Loan Corporation did. Areas of spotty city services and redlining for large numbers of the unemployed, the elderly, and the recipients of welfare are left to wait for assistance, which does not seem to be forthcoming. Does that sound like it's maybe black people live there? Now, they never said, you know, they denied that they were saying that you should just ignore these areas. They denied that these areas should not get city services, because that's what they were accused of doing. They were denying that they said these areas should be neglected, because that's what they were accused of. But they said you kind of have to put them on the back burner as far as development is concerned. Well, and what made this so controversial is that the city tried to keep it under wraps. And the Post-Dispatch had to actually, I don't know if they got freedom of information, I don't know, but they had to actually pressure the city of St. Louis to finally get this report. And the fact that it was enveloped in so much secrecy made people suspicious of this document. If there's nothing wrong with it, if there's nothing designating black areas to be neglected, then why is it such a secret? Which they never explained. But anyway, as you can see, this is something that we just got into our collection, which is black people that were organizing to fight this Team 4 plan. Of course, the Team 4 plan, according to the city of St. Louis, was never implemented formally. Some people would argue that in spirit, it was implemented. I happen to live in North St. Louis, and I can tell you there's been a lot of neglect, a lot of disinvestment. Seems a lot like Team 4. But anyway, so disparities in home ownership are a major driver of the racial wealth gap, and that's from the Aspen Institute. And of course, you'll see this over and over again. Every institute that starts off talking about the wealth gap always relates it to home ownership. Now, there are other ways to build wealth, but this is the way most people are able to build wealth and to build generational wealth. I think this is interesting because this is the median income, net worth, this is my race in 1919. Blacks are at the very bottom, as you can see. And then with home ownership, again, blacks are at the very bottom. Now I want to talk about a little bit about, just bring it to an end by talking about, if I can find this data, okay? Because this is specifically about St. Louis. Most of what I said kind of looks at the national, what's happening nationally. For this, of course, is national, but it reflects what's going on in St. Louis as well. But I want to speak specifically about St. Louis. In 2021, the average white household in St. Louis earned $77,695, almost twice as much as the average black household income of $41,562. White households have the highest median income of $55,000. Black households have the lowest median income of $28,000, followed by Hispanic households of $34,200. Now, as far as home ownership, federal data show that more than 80% of white people in St. Louis County own a home, while fewer than half of the county's black residents do. There's disparity tracks in the city as well, where nearly 65% of white people own a house compared to 35% of black people. Even among homeowners, there's a big gap in what homes are worth. The median income value for a black family in the county is about $150,000 lower than for a white family. In the city, it's about $100,000 lower for a black family than a white one. Just last week, no, 2 weeks ago, there was an article in the St. Louis American that talked about this very issue. They looked at it more from a national standpoint about the inability of blacks to be able to buy a home and how this was impacting black wealth. And let me just say, I'm just gonna also just show you, just want to rattle off a number of the corporations and the institutes, think tanks that are studying this issue. It's become an issue that really is beginning to get some traction. The RAND Corporation, which we've talked about, the Brookings Institute, the Urban Institute, the Aspen Institute, they're all studying the racial wealth gap. The Center for American Progress, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, the ACLU, the Center for the Study of Wealth and Inequality, Institute for Economic Equity at the Federal Reserve Bank. And they're studying specifically the wealth gap in St. Louis. So they're going to be coming out with some really interesting data, statistics. I'm really looking forward to that. The Ford Foundation, Oxfam America, and that's just a few. All of these think tanks, these institutes are studying this issue, which they think, or which they argue, is one of the most vexing problems in the country today. So what do you do about this? Now, this is from the Urban Institute. And each one of these institutes, these think tanks, have their own list of priorities, their own list of solutions about how you deal with this problem and how you solve this problem. And I chose this one because, not because I think it's necessarily best, but because number one, it's 5 points, it's simple. A lot of them, sometimes they have 15, 20. Things that they advance, and it's relatively simple and it's broad. But I think it's a good start. Advanced policy solutions at the local level, tackle housing supply constraints and affordability, on and on and on. You can see that what they do. Now, I'll tell you, a lot of these, I shouldn't say a lot, I'll take that back. Some of these organizations advocate for reparations. And just for full disclosure, I'm on the St. Louis City Mayor's Reparations Commission. So, I might be a little biased about this, but how do you close this gap when they're saying that it's going to take 228 years before Black people can even come close to being on an even par? Some of these institutes argue that it will not be close. The best you can do is lessen it. And one of the reasons that this is such a problem, especially with this home ownership, because they say this is the engine that drives all other racial inequities. There's so many disparities: health disparities, income disparities, education disparities, disparities in incarceration, disparities in arrest. All of these disparities are driven by the wealth gap. That's why so many of these institutes are focusing on this issue. So with that, I don't know if we have time for questions or comments.
Yes.
And I'd be,
All right.
and let me say, I'm not an economist, but I'm just a person that studies this issue from a historical point of view. I'm interested in the history, how it came to be.
Can we ask you to come up to the microphone?
I'm just gonna ask an overall question. Is the Urban Institute just in St. Louis?
The Federal
When you say
Reserve,
the Urban Institute, is that a St.
No.
Louis?
but the Federal Reserve Bank,
No, Urban Institute.
no,
It's national. It's a national
Right,
organization.
right. Now they're in at the Federal Reserve Bank here in St. Louis.
Urban Institute.
Okay,
All right, let's, if you would line up, at the microphone so that you can ask your questions and we'll take questions. For about 20 minutes or so.
Gwen, can you address the issue with how houses are appraised differently if there's a black and white family, and then what are the ramifications of that?
oh,
Of real estate appraisals of property?
Oh.
Yeah.
yeah, that's been the news quite a bit too, because if a home is owned by blacks, they found that it gets a lower appraisal than if it's owned by whites, and blacks are now being advised to strip their houses of anything that smacks of blackness and don't be around when the appraiser comes by. Maybe you can have somebody else around, because they found that if you appraise a black person's house, it's seen as black, they have like photographs on the wall, or maybe Afrocentric furnishings, it gets a lower rate, a lower appraisal than if it was a white person's house, where they don't have those things.
Going on still now.
So it's going on now. That's recent history, very recent, contemporary history.
Thank you.
Is it on?
Yes.
I have a cold, so be careful next person. Thank you for talking about Team 4. Some of us were actually fairly close to that group of people. I wondered if you wanted to comment also on the impact of the Blackjack case, housing case. That's of course outside of the city, but was, at least I thought it was an important moment also.
Yeah, we talked about that as one of those pivotal cases when we did the civil rights. When we did the civil rights exhibit.
You're welcome.
Okay, we talked. Is it on? Oh, yeah, we did talk about that case when we did the civil rights exhibit. It's when the city of Blackjack tried to block.
Well, we can't hear you. Let's get this.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe take this.
I don't.
I do like it.
I can shout maybe.
Don't hold that one very close to you.
Okay. No, it's off. There, try it. It was off.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was saying that, yeah, the Blackjack case was one where there was an attempt, there was a plan to build modern housing in Blackjack, in the city of Blackjack, tried to zone it out of existence. So to prevent this building of this low to moderate income housing, because they didn't want black people there. So that was another important case. And that's been, I'm in Clayton right now. One of the questions I usually ask is, why is there no low income housing in Clayton? Why is there no moderate income housing in Clayton? I don't know. And at one time, and can I say, you do know that at one time there was a black enclave in Clayton that was also destroyed. It was a very small enclave, but yeah.
We do have a women's voices group that's working on affordable housing at leisure.
Oh, okay. That's
our leisure, right?
who? Wonderful. Wonderful.
I had a question, and I thank you very much. It was a fascinating discussion and very eye-opening. I knew some of it, but I really hadn't connected it as far back as you have. I'm curious as to the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008. I mean, it was horrendously racially biased, and I wonder how much that contributed to even more of a racial wealth gap than was already existing.
Well, you know, a lot of Black people were targeted for the subprime loans. And of course, when it collapsed, a lot of Black people lost their homes. So it had a devastating impact. This is a pattern. I don't think as you can see, that's what I wanted to show, that this is a pattern that dates back to when Black people first got here. And I think that's the point, that it hasn't, I shouldn't say it hasn't changed, because of course there's been some progress. But as you can see from these figures, even today, Blacks have the lowest rate of home ownership among any other racial or ethnic group. They have the lowest median income compared to any other racial group. And you know, this, I guess the point that I'm trying to show is it's not an accident. It's a result of public policy, public practices, private policy. I think too often we let I really like to put a spotlight on the real estate industry, because so often we just talk about government policies. But what about the policies of the real estate industry that have done everything to make sure that Black people didn't own houses?
Right. And I wonder if you would add the mortgage industry and the banking industry. I mean, obviously, there were policies
exactly. In
driving
fact,
all of
that has been one of the I can't remember which one, but they recommended the establishment of postal banks, because they said that was the best way for Black people to get loans, because it's hard for them to get loans from banks. So you got to think about the banking system as well.
Yeah, it's so pervasive. It's
a pervasive. You know, with all these policies and practices, I'll just be honest and blatant. It all comes down to racism and discrimination. That's the bottom line.
yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is perhaps an unfair question, but if you could change just one thing about our practices here in the St. Louis area to make it more equitable for Blacks to enjoy the benefits of home ownership, what would that one thing be?
Well, I guess I shouldn't show my hand.
Go for it.
You know,
I told you it's not fair.
yeah, you're gonna have to put money in the hands of Black people. They've been deprived of money. They've been deprived of income. And people always say, well, I wasn't, no slave is still alive. I've never owned a slave. But it's not just the slavery. That was just the beginning. It's like with the Homestead Acts. If Black people were able to take advantage of those Homestead Acts, I wouldn't be standing up here today. And like Martin Luther King said, if the 40 acres and a mule promise had been fulfilled, I wouldn't be standing up here today. 40 acres and a mule was reparations. They don't call it that, it was reparations. And if we thought reparations was good in 1865, is it good in 2024? Can it solve problems in 2024? They started solving a problem in 1865 when those Republican congressmen passed the Southern Homestead Act. They wanted to correct what they did wrong with the Homestead Act of 1862. That in a way, it was reparations. Because they realized that the only way Blacks were going to be able to have economic security and economic independence was to have land.
I knew some builders about 30 years ago.
We can't turn it around.
I knew some builders about 30, 35 years ago. And they were telling me that this was gonna be bad for everybody, whites and blacks alike. They could not get a loan to build a small house. The banks wanted more money, they wanted larger mortgages. And so you drive around St. Louis, you're gonna see these 12 or 1,400 square foot homes. You can't build one today, you can't find one for sale new. They're all 2, 3, 400, 2 or 3,000 square foot houses.
You have a question, sir?
No, I have a comment.
Well,
So one of the
Let's
things,
do the question.
okay, well, how are you going to solve a problem like this when the banks aren't gonna let you do it?
well, like I said, there are a lot of recommendations that are coming out of these think tanks. And of course, they recognize the problem with banks. That's why they're recommending something like instituting postal banks, where loans will be available to African Americans without discrimination. You know, I mentioned this article from the St. Louis American because you brought up other issues as well about the houses, the unaffordability of houses now, not just for Blacks, but for many people, which is a problem that has to be tackled as well. I mean, it's a complicated issue.
Thank you.
With no easy, I don't know, there are no easy solutions. I definitely don't have an answer.
Thank you for your work on this. It seems as though 100 or 150 years ago, when everything was so, you could read how discriminatory it was. Nowadays, we spend 50% of our time just trying to figure out what people are dog whistling to us, because we get, you know, in our neighborhoods and everything, you're constantly combating that. Like we're in a neighborhood association, and yet everybody talks like they want an integrated neighborhood, but then you have to dig down into that. So you mentioned on the 5-point plan about if we can do local policy solutions, that's probably one of the best points that we can do. Do you know of anything maybe at the city level or anything that's coming up or in progress that we can support in our local neighborhoods and things like that, that would really kind of give a boost to anything that's maybe has some kind of a groundswell?
I wish I did. You know, there's, you know, I live in North St. Louis City, and you know, with our current administration, there's a promise that more money is going to be put into our communities, that there's going to be more development or redevelopment, that these decades and decades of neglect, there's going to be an attempt to reverse it. My argument is that you let it go too far. Where I live, it's become depopulated. Vacant buildings. I moved into that neighborhood when I was a kid, and I still live there. When I moved into that neighborhood, it was a stable neighborhood. There were no vacant houses, no vacant lots, no falling down buildings, no deteriorating buildings. There are now. And that was because of policy decisions. That was because of a Team 4 plan that didn't get implemented. That there's been this sort of neglect of these neighborhoods, and they neglect these neighborhoods, in my opinion, because they don't respect the people that live there. Because they see us as lesser than, and they can get away with it. And we don't have as much money. as other neighborhoods do, so people in other neighborhoods do. To me, the solution is you gotta put money in people's hands. That's what it comes down to. And you got to trust them to do the right thing, and they will. We will do the right thing with that money in our hands.
That's maybe what we'll start to promote then.
The last one here.
Okay, we're coming into an election season. What questions should we be asking people that are running for office? What are they gonna do to help solve this problem?
That's the question.
What, of all of us
Yeah,
asking.
are you aware, I mean, number one, they should be aware of this problem. They should know that it's a, I mean, the information out there on the wealth gap, it's almost overwhelming. I mean, it's not something that's hidden. They should know about this, and they should have a plan to address this. Now, I'm gonna give the mayor of the city of St. Louis some credit, because at least she's come up with a commission to study this problem and come up with solutions to this problem. So at least she's on the right track. But I think every politician should be asked about this problem. Do you know about this problem? Tell me about this problem if you know about this problem. And what can we do? What can you do as my elected representative to begin to solve this problem? And of course, it's not going to be solved overnight. It's that even with some intervention, it might take 100 years.
So we
Even
have
with
our talking
intervention
point.
and
We have our
policies in
talking
place.
point.
Yeah, so, yeah, but the point is you can start. I mean, let's say Black people were enslaved for 56, 65 years, something like that. And then after that, Jim Crow and segregation. We're talking about 300 years of this kind of racism and discrimination. And how do you start reversing that? What do you do to make amends for that? You can't go back in time and change anything. But what can we do to make amends for this? First of all, you have to see it as a problem.
Thank you.
And some people don't see it as a problem, unfortunately.
But thank you, yeah. In terms of the people who are running for office, I'm going to a candidates night coming up.
Oh.
Oh, to ask them, what are you gonna do about it? That's a great call to action.
Yeah.
Because we're in election season. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Well, can I say something
Yeah,
that might be a little controversial? Support reparations.
yes. Yes.
I know it's not popular. But reparations, if you don't want to just give me a check, which I would appreciate, there are other things that you can do that would help to build Black wealth,
So.
or to close that gap.
So
And let me just say one thing. When I say Black wealth, I don't mean make Black people rich.
yeah.
Wealth, assets minus liabilities, just put us kind of on an even keel.
But, so it sounds like though, I know you're working on the reparations commission. The reparations commission, I assume, will eventually come out with a report and some recommendations, and we could support those. That's that's a call to action.
Exactly.
I really feel. Great, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, so yes,
Is there any discussion on the transfer of wealth that's happening between for those of us who are older now? There's a lot of discussion about the fact that we might transfer a lot of wealth to our children, and because they've raised the amount that can be transferred tax-free.
is that part, are you asking, is that part of the
Yeah, is that
reparations?
part of any discussion on
On the transfer of wealth?
Oh, as far as what, the reparations commission?
Generational transfer of wealth.
We're at the, I'm not at liberty to say.
Okay,
We're gonna be writing our report.
okay,
We're gonna
so
be right
there'll be a report that comes out. Okay, so I wanted to say a couple of things and then give a final thank you. I want to remind you there was a handout that you got, most of you, when you came in, and it has some resources on it. If you want to continue your own awareness building, your own learning, There are a lot of good suggestions on this, about race, about racism. There are a lot of good suggestions on here. And also in the back of the room, we have with us, someone who is taking signatures, please, to get, abortion on the ballot in the next election. So please make sure you, sign the, oh, and then this is also, yes, we're also working with a student, who is working on looking at racial comments that are currently still on the feeds in the city, to get them removed. So anyway, thank you, Gwen, very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you asking.